They fired me the same morning my brother posted photos of his new boat. I didn't find out about the layoff from my manager. I found out because my badge stopped working at the front door of the building where I had spent 6 years of my life. I stood in the January cold, swiping the card over and over, watching the little light blink red, while a security guard I didn't recognize walked over and told me, quietly, that I should come with him. My box was already packed. Someone had done it for me. My laptop, my desk plant, a framed photo of my dog. Neat, efficient, like they'd been planning it for a while. I was a contracts analyst for a mid-size pharmaceutical company. My job was reading the fine print that other people skipped. I was good at it. I had been promoted twice in 4 years, and I was 3 months away from vesting a stock package worth roughly $40,000. The HR rep who handed me my termination paperwork cited restructuring. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Tell me in the comments, has anyone ever done something for you that they called love, but looking back, it was just control? I read every single one. I didn't cry in the parking lot. I put my box in the trunk of my car and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, watching my breath fog the windshield. Then I picked up my phone and called the one person I always called when things fell apart. My mother answered on the second ring. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice warm in that particular way that used to feel like a blanket and now, thinking back, felt more like a net. "I already heard. I'm so sorry." I paused. "How did you already hear?" "Your brother called me this morning. He was worried about you." My brother, Daniel, 29 years old, never held a job longer than 11 months, currently posting Instagram photos of a boat he had named, without irony, Second Wind. Daniel, who our mother had once described to a neighbor as the creative one, which was her gentle way of explaining why he'd never paid rent on time in his life. I told her I was fine. I told her I just needed a few days to figure out my next steps. She told me to come home for the weekend, that she'd make my favorite dinner, pot roast, and that everything would look better after some rest. I said I'd think about it. I did not think about it. I drove home, changed into sweatpants, and opened my laptop. Here is something they don't tell you about being a contracts analyst. The skills don't turn off. When the rest of my life felt like it was dissolving, my brain kept doing the same thing it always did. Looking for the clause. Looking for what didn't match. And something did not match. I'd been at that company for 6 years. I had strong performance reviews, 2 promotions, a manager who'd told me 4 months ago that I was being considered for a senior role. Companies restructure. Yes. But they don't usually restructure by quietly packing one person's box before that person even arrives at work. They don't typically do it 90 days before a vesting date, unless someone has done the math and decided that paying out $40,000 in stock was less attractive than manufacturing a reason not to. I requested my personnel file that afternoon. It's your legal right in most states, and I knew that. I also sent a polite email to HR asking for the specific criteria used to select my position for elimination. Then I called my friend Priya. Priya was an employment attorney. We'd met in a spin class 4 years ago and bonded over our mutual hatred of the instructor's playlist. She was sharp and careful, and she did not do anything casually, including answer her phone at 7 in the evening. "Talk to me," she said. So I talked. I told her about the badge, the box, the 90-day gap before vesting. I told her about the HR rep who wouldn't look at me. I told her about the senior role conversation 4 months ago, and the fact that I had that in writing, an email from my manager that said, and I am paraphrasing, that I was the strongest internal candidate and that the formal process would begin in Q1. Priya was quiet for a moment. "Did they give you a severance agreement to sign?" "They did. 2 weeks, standard. Non-disclosure clause, general release of all claims." "Do not sign that," she said. "Not yet. Give me 48 hours. I told her I wouldn't sign anything. Old habit. I spent the rest of that evening doing what I do. I built a timeline. I pulled every email I'd saved, every performance review, every message chain that touched on the senior role conversation. I am the kind of person who archives everything, not out of paranoia, but because I was raised in a house where people frequently remembered things differently than they had actually happened, and I had learned early that documents do not gaslight you. That was when I found the thread I had forgotten about. 6 weeks before I was fired, there had been a reorganization of reporting structures. My manager, Greg, had sent a department-wide email announcing that 3 analysts, myself included, would be temporarily reassigned to support a new product launch. The email had been unremarkable. What was remarkable, I now realized, was that it had been sent on the same day that Daniel had attended a networking event hosted by our company's VP of Business Development. I knew this because Daniel had texted me about it at the time, excited, saying he'd met someone who knew where I worked and that maybe there was an opportunity there for him. I had responded with something encouraging and forgotten about it entirely. I looked at the date of that text. I looked at the date of Greg's reorganization email. Same day, October 14th. I pulled up Daniel's social media. In November, he had started posting about a new consulting role. Vague posts, the kind that say a lot without saying anything. Excited to be partnering with innovative teams in the healthcare space. Big things coming. The boat photos had started in December. I want to be careful here. I want to tell you exactly what I knew and what I suspected, because those are different things. And in my line of work, the difference matters. What I knew, I was fired 90 days before vesting. I had documentation of a senior role conversation that contradicted the restructuring narrative. My brother had connected with someone at my company 6 weeks before my termination. My brother had a new unexplained income source. What I suspected, I kept to myself, for now. My mother called again on Thursday. She said my aunt was asking about me, that the family was worried, that it might be good for me to come home and be around people who loved me. I had not been home in 4 months. My parents lived 40 minutes away. The reason I had not visited in 4 months was a conversation we'd had at Thanksgiving that I was still quietly processing, a conversation in which my father had asked me, in front of everyone, why I was so focused on my career when Daniel was really the one who needed my support right now, and I had said, carefully, that I was focused on my career because I paid my own bills, and there had been a silence that lasted the rest of the meal. I told my mother I'd come Saturday. I went Saturday. My mother made pot roast. My father hugged me at the door and said I looked tired. Daniel wasn't there, which my mother explained by saying he had a work thing, which was new, Daniel having work things on a Saturday. We ate dinner. My father asked how the job search was going. I said I was still assessing my options. He nodded with an expression I recognized, the particular look of a man who considers a woman being careful to be the same thing as a woman being indecisive. Then my mother said gently that she wanted to talk to me about something. She said that Daniel was going through a hard time financially. Not crisis level, she clarified quickly, but he had some gaps, some outstanding balances, and it would really mean a lot if I could help bridge things until his new consulting work picked up. She mentioned a number, $11,000. I put my fork down. I am not a person who performs emotions. I don't cry at the table or raise my voice. What I do is get very, very still. Mom, I said, I was just laid off. I know, sweetheart, but you have your savings, and you've always been so responsible, and Daniel just needs a little runway. Once he gets established, he'll pay you back. You know he will. I looked at my father. He was eating his pot roast and looking at the middle distance, which was his way of being present at a conversation without technically participating in it. I have to think about it, I said. My mother smiled the way she always smiled when she thought she had already won. I drove home and called Priya. She had news. Her contact at the State Labor Board had flagged something interesting in my file request. The official documentation for my termination included a reorganization chart that had been submitted internally in October. On that chart, my position had been marked for elimination, annotated as redundant, 2 months before I was ever told anything about a restructuring. The annotation was dated October 15th, one day after Daniel's networking event. It wasn't proof of anything on its own. A position being quietly flagged internally wasn't illegal. But combined with everything else, it was the kind of detail that tends to matter when you're sitting across from someone in a deposition. There's more, Priya said. I asked her contact to pull the vendor registry for the company's new product launch. There's a consulting firm listed as a brand strategy partner. They signed the contract in November. What's the firm, I asked. Second Wind Consulting LLC, registered in Delaware. The registered agent is listed as Daniel Marcus Calloway. I sat with that for a moment. My brother had somehow landed a consulting contract with my company. My position had been quietly marked redundant the day after he attended a networking event there. 90 days later, I had been walked out with a box of my belongings before I could vest $40,000 in stock. And now my mother was asking me to give him $11,000. I want to tell you about a particular kind of grief that doesn't have a good name. It's not the grief of losing something suddenly. It's the grief of seeing something clearly for the first time and understanding that it was never what you thought it was. My family had always treated Daniel as the one who needed protecting. I had always been the one who was fine, who was capable, who could handle things. I had believed that was a kind of respect. I understood now that it was just a different kind of use. I was not fine. I was just easier to take from. I told Priya everything. About the $11,000. about Thanksgiving, about the boat named Second Wind, which we now understood to be a fairly audacious choice of name for a company funded, at least in part, by the elimination of his sister's job. Priya was quiet for a long moment. Here's the thing, she said. What your brother did, if he leveraged a connection to facilitate your termination, if there was any coordination between him and someone at that company to manufacture a reason to let you go before your vesting date, that is tortious interference. It's a civil claim. But the piece that makes it interesting is the stock. What do you mean? Those shares were compensation, earned compensation. If there was coordination specifically timed to deprive you of vested compensation, that starts to look less like a messy family situation and more like something the Department of Labor finds notable. I asked her what she needed from me. Everything, she said. Send me everything. I did not call my mother that night. I did not call her the next day either. I let her call me, which she did, twice, and I let both go to voicemail. I needed to think without her voice in my head. This is what I kept coming back to. My mother had called me the day I was fired, already knowing, because Daniel had called her. Daniel had called her, not to ask if I was okay, not out of guilt. He had called her to manage the narrative before I could. He knew what he had done, and his first move was to make sure our mother was already positioned to redirect me towards sympathy for him by the time I processed what had happened. That was not a mistake. That was a strategy. On Wednesday, Priya filed a formal complaint with the State Labor Board, citing wrongful termination and intentional interference with vested compensation. She also sent a litigation hold letter to my former employer, which meant they were now legally required to preserve all internal communications related to my termination, including any communications involving outside vendors or consultants. On Thursday, my former employer's legal team called Priya. They were, she reported, very interested in settling. On Friday, my mother called me, and this time I answered, "Sweetheart, have you thought any more about Daniel's situation?" "I have," I said. "I've actually been doing a lot of thinking this week." "I'm glad to hear it. He's really counting on you." "Mom," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Did you know that Daniel had a connection at my company before I was let go?" There was a pause. The particular quality of the pause told me everything. "He mentioned he'd met someone at a networking event," she said carefully, "but I don't see what that has to do with—" "Did you know," I said again, "that the consulting contract he got was from my company, that it was signed the same month I was put on a list to be eliminated?" Another pause. "These things are complicated," she said. "Business is complicated. Daniel needed an opportunity, and—" I stopped her there. "I'm going to tell you what's going to happen," I said. "My attorney has filed a formal complaint. My former employer is already in contact with her because they know what the documentation shows. Whatever arrangement Daniel made, there's now a legal process attached to it. I want you to know that before you make any more calls on his behalf." My mother's voice shifted. That warm, soft quality went somewhere else. "You would do this to your own brother, after everything we've done for you?" I thought about Thanksgiving. I thought about the box in the parking lot. I thought about the boat. "I'm not doing anything to Daniel," I said. "I'm just stopping letting things be done to me." I hung up. I turned my phone over on the table and looked at the ceiling for a while. 3 weeks later, my former employer settled. I cannot tell you the specific terms. What I can tell you is that I received my vested stock value in full, a settlement figure that reflected 18 months of additional compensation, and a neutral reference letter. The settlement agreement was drafted by their attorneys and reviewed by Priya, and there was a particular clause in it that had nothing to do with money but that I had specifically requested. A provision formally withdrawing the consulting contract with Second Wind Consulting LLC, citing a conflict of interest identified during internal review. Daniel lost the contract. I don't know exactly what my mother said to him. I don't know what their dinner table conversations looked like in the weeks after. I know that my father called me once, left a voicemail, said that I had handled things in a way that had hurt the family, and that he hoped I would reflect on that. I saved the voicemail, not to be cruel, just because I was raised in a house where people remembered things differently than they actually happened, and I had learned a long time ago to keep documentation. My mother texted me 6 weeks later. Nothing about the settlement, nothing about Daniel, just a photo of the pot roast she'd made for Sunday dinner with a caption that said, "Miss you, hope you're doing well." I looked at that text for a long time. Then I put my phone down and went back to what I was doing, which was reviewing the offer letter for a new position. Senior contracts analyst, larger company, better benefits, and a stock vesting schedule that began on day one. I read every line. Old habit. There's a version of this story where I feel sad about it, where I grieve the family I thought I had. I do. Sometimes, in the way you grieve something you understand was never entirely real. But mostly what I feel is the specific, quiet relief of a person who has stopped spending energy maintaining a fiction. I used to think the hardest part of this kind of situation was the betrayal. I was wrong. The hardest part is much simpler than that. It's the moment you realize you have to choose between protecting the story everyone agreed to tell and protecting yourself. I chose myself. I'm still here. If you've ever been the capable one, the responsible one, the one people counted on to stay quiet and hold the line, drop the word standing in the comments. I want to know I'm not the only one. And if this story hit close to home, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is let someone know that choosing yourself is not the same thing as betraying everyone else.